Hi everyone, thanks for being here. This is the last Polycon UK of the semester before we start again in January. Well, we'll send you reminders. We're very pleased to have today Arianna Ornaghi, who's an assistant professor of economics at the Hertie School in Berlin. She's also a research affiliate at CPR and CESIFO, very impressive track record of publications, including the most prestigious outlets in the profession. And she's also a former member of our team, then Brexited, I guess. So the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you very much for having me, for inviting me to give this talk. It's really nice to be back with this webinar. And thanks everyone for being here. So today I'm going to be presenting joint work with Johannes Böken, Mirko, Draca, and Nicola Mastrorocco. And the paper that I'm going to be telling you about is entitled Returns to Viral Media, the Case of US Political Donations. What we do in this paper is that we try to characterize returns to attention on Twitter by looking specifically at campaign contribution to US politicians. Great. So the starting point for this paper is the recognition that social media really represents a major structural change in mass communication. In particular, relative to the concentrated top-down broadcast model of traditional media, think of newspapers, think of TV, social media has very low barriers to entry, which means that we can think of it as truly a multi-channel communication technology. Now, what this implies is that there are huge amounts of information that are produced and shared on social media every day. And as a result of this, attention has really become the scarce commodity online. And we think that this is fairly interesting because the fact that attention is so limited creates potentially interesting competition across different content producers and makes attaining popularity particularly relevant. So what we're interested in doing in this paper is understanding how the market for attention on social media is characterized, to give an idea of what type of features we're going to be thinking about. We're going to be thinking, for example, about, first of all, are there returns in the offline world from social media attention, but conditional on finding that, we're going to be thinking about whether returns vary with the level of attention. We're going to be thinking about whether the returns that we're going to see are going to be very distributed, or are we going to see kind of a winner takes all type of market. And we're also going to be thinking about different messaging, how different messaging translates into different returns. The specific setting that we are going to use to investigate this question is political communication. And I'm sure I don't have to be the one telling you that social media is really key is truly one of the key tools of political campaigning today, and it allows kind of this direct communication between politicians and voters. We're going to be focusing in particular on the attention that members of Congress in the US receive on Twitter, and we're going to be linking that to the small campaign donations, to the small campaign donation that these politicians receive, and we're going to use this to estimate returns to the attention on Twitter. So we're going to be thinking in this paper mainly of campaign donations as a financial metric that is very handy to us because it allows us to estimate the returns to attention. And we like looking at campaign donations because it is a high frequency outcome, it is a real world outcome, and something that we think politicians care about. So we're not going to be we're going to be looking at a rather specific outcome. You can think there are other reasons why politicians might also be online, why they might be using Twitter. And while we're not going to be able to speak directly to that, you can think that any sort of kind of attention, any sort of returns, be it in kind of brand building or kind of electoral outreach more generally, as long as they really depend on attention, perhaps we are also going to be able to say something about it more broadly by looking at this very specific subsetting. And again, we really like campaign donations because the fact that we have kind of this very high frequency data with a lot of interesting variation allows us to really go beyond studying whether there is a relationship between attention online and donations, but also how the two relate. Okay, now we're not the first one to think about the question of how campaign donation relate to online activity. And I'm sure many of you are already thinking about one of the key papers in this area, which is a paper by Maria Petrova and co-authors, which was published in Management Science in 2021. And what they're looking at in this paper is a little bit of an earlier period on Twitter. They're looking at 2013, 2014. And they're looking at the effect of opening a Twitter account on political donations. And what they find is that there is a positive relationship between being on Twitter and receiving political donations. And what is particularly interesting for us is that they find that outsiders politicians, that is, non-incumbents that are running for elections, are the ones that are really benefiting from being on Twitter. Now, we're looking at a different period in our paper. In particular, we are looking at 2019-2020, where we think that the dynamics of social media have really changed. So we're going to be looking in particular at a period where Twitter has reached maturity. It's not a question of whether or not you're on social media. Basically, every member of Congress that is going to be in Congress is going to have a Twitter account. And interestingly, it's a moment in which the user base in the US has somewhat reached a plateau. And we think that this potentially gives rise to very different dynamics in terms of the returns to attention. In particular, we think that really at this stage, competition for attention really might become a first order constraint. It's not about whether you're social media or not, is how much reach your message can actually get on social media that is going to matter. And we think that this is important to think about because this different market structure at infancy and maturity might imply very different winners and losers for this type of communication. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? We are going to be studying US members of Congress in the period from 2019 to October 2020. And we're going to be focusing for this paper on the incumbents. We're going to then estimate the donations attention relationship using two different empirical approaches. We are going to start with a member of Congress by day panel. And we are going to use this panel to estimate relatively strict specification that in general are only going to be exploiting within member of Congress month variation. Now we're going to be able to do a lot of interesting things with this approach, but as you're going to see, maybe we're not going to be able to give you a foolproof, like a bulletproof causal identification for this part. And so to really show that what we are seeing is something that we can think of as a causal estimate, we also augment our panel with the geographic variation, and we're going to be testing whether indeed the effect is driven by areas with higher Twitter usage, and this is also going to allow us to implement an IP strategy. And as you can imagine, we are going to estimate a lot of companion specifications that are going to allow us to characterize the shape of the relationship. So what do we find? Well, our first result, perhaps not the main one, is that Twitter likes, which are our proxy for attention received on Twitter, Twitter likes are going to be positively related to donations. However, we are also going to see that on average, the magnitude is modest. Now, what is perhaps our main results in this paper is that this modest average magnitude is actually masking substantial heterogeneity because returns are highly skewed. So the way in which we're thinking about this result is that, well, Twitter is and can be an effective technology to increase donations, but it's not going to be a technology that works for everyone. And we're going to be spending some time thinking about to what extent people who use Twitter for political communication are different than people that use other type of media, for example, cable news or newspapers. We are going to see, interestingly, that there is some competition for attention. In particular, we're going to be estimating spillovers and crowding out on the attention margin, but conditional on receiving attention, we're not going to see spillovers on donations. We're also going to see, kind of in line with the literature, that emotionally negative and ideologically polar positions do attract attention, but the effect of donation is not going to be heterogeneous along these lines. So we're going to see a lot of action on the attention side, a lot of differences, dynamics, but conditional on getting attention, in general, we're going to see the same returns.
I can ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned you measure activity by likes.
Mm-hmm.
Did you try the replies and conversations and what is it?
Mm-hmm.
Reposts or whatever, it's
Mm-hmm.
retweets, as you call it.
Yes, so we're mainly going to be focusing on likes for this paper, but we also check the robustness of these results to other proxies for attention, for example, retweets. I think we have retweets, quote tweets, and replies, and we find very similar dynamics, which is interesting because it's true that we generally think of this type of interaction, signaling some slight differences in interaction, but it seems that anyways they correlate in our case with overall attention, which is ultimately what we are interested in seeing.
Just that this relates to this ongoing, forever discussion, what is a fake interaction by trolls, for example, or bots. And what is the genuine interaction? And I think there is this concept of ratio. So it's not only that likes, but high response rate without likes has a different meaning than the opposite, for example.
Yes, no, this is an excellent point. I think our kind of certain kind of answer to get a little bit around that is thinking that, well, if there's a lot of this fake interaction, in a way, it's kind of biasing us against finding an effect. However, probably there's more we can do to think about bots specifically and thinking about this angle. We are going to see that one of the things that we are thinking about actively are the magnitudes. And for thinking about magnitudes, these sort of questions are perhaps very relevant as well. If you're thinking about the return of the marginal like, perhaps a lot of what we are doing in this paper is kind of moving us towards a lower bound, which I think in terms of estimation is fine, but in terms of really thinking about magnitudes, maybe it's not ideal.
Can I ask you again? So if you elaborate on this idea that fake interaction and bots lead to attenuation, because one way we think about this is, I'm a politician. I don't expect, Twitter is composed of like bored old men really into politics. I don't expect that most of the people who vote for me spend time on Twitter. But if I manage to go viral, then this makes it to news that then end up shared with the people that I care about. And to the extent that I can pay for bots, I'm just going to be a bit strategic and pay to, the right kind of posts at the right time that really define me as a politician.
So that's something that could be going on. We see that attention on Twitter is very specific. It's not it's not just picking up something that then is like goes through the news cycle, like either way. So we're going to see that we're going to see separate returns for being in the news and being and going viral on Twitter. There could be some strategy. I don't think that's what is driving our effect. You're going to see that a lot of the patterns that we're going to find are kind of against this strategy. We're working on doing a little bit more robustness to exclude exactly, for example, media coverage about tweets. It doesn't end up being the bulk of what we're seeing here, I think. But it is true that it could be that what we're seeing here is something that's very specific. It's a very specific type of political communication that's targeting a specific subpopulation. So that's also worth thinking about. Great. Good. And so reassuringly, we're going to show that these results, that the result that we find is really going to be driven by high Twitter user states and is going to be robust to using an IV strategy. Okay, so we're thinking about this paper has contributed to two main strands of literature. First of all, of course, we think that we contribute to the growing literature that is focused on understanding the effects of social media on political outcomes. We focus on a very specific political behavior, which is this decision to donate a campaign, and relative to work in this area before, we are going to do more to characterize returns to attention, particularly when the platform has reached maturity. We also contribute by looking at campaign donations to the growing political economy literature that's thinking about the determinants of campaign contributions, and very much in line with the recent paper by Laurent Bouton and co-authors, we are going to find some suggestive evidence of expressive motives being behind the decision to donate to a political campaign. And here, to clarify, we're looking at small political campaigns for the bulk of the paper. Now, because going viral matters, we're also going to see some evidence that pull factor might be at play as well, but other motives that have been hypothesized, so for example, kind of access motives or whatnot, don't seem to be driving what we are seeing. Now, what we're going to also see is that the market for attention that we are going to characterize for Twitter is going to show hallmarks of superstar markets. However, relative to the literature that thinks about the characteristics of superstar markets specifically, we are going to find some kind of returns of relatively small magnitudes, which potentially suggests that returns from Twitter activity are lying somewhere else, and that's something that we are thinking about more broadly. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the data that we use in this paper. For this project, we really need two main sources of data. We need data on attention on Twitter and data on campaign donations. So to look at attention on social media, we collected data on the Twitter activity of members of Congress in the 116th Congress. We collected the text of all tweets and respective metrics, likes, retweets, and reply, for about 401 members of Congress, that basically all of them were missing some for technical reasons. This gives us a corpus of about 1.1 million tweets over this same period, and we aggregate this data at the day by member of Congress level, because that's the level at which we have the information on campaign donations. We collect the information on individual campaign contributions from public FEC datasets. And what we have here are all direct and indirect donations to politicians. And we focus in particular on small donations that we define on donations of value less than $1,000. This is this corresponds to about 94% of all donors and about 37% of donations amount. In addition to this, we combine a lot of other data sources. So, for example, we are going to be using data on news coverage of members of Congress. We have cable news. We have actually recently augmented to also look at New York Times mentions, local newspaper mentions. We are kind of trying to we're trying to build a richer set of controls, and I'm going to show you the ones that we have in a while. We also have, for our IV strategy, which perhaps surprisingly is using the South by Southwest instrument for Mueller and Schwartz. We have Twitter users at the state level and South by Southwest followers at the state level that we took from their paper. And we also have a bunch of additional controls, like county-level controls, electoral results, and some descriptives on Twitter users from the American National Election Survey for the same time period. This is how our data looks like. And it's helping us to kind of already set some features of the market. So on average, our members of Congress send out about 3 tweets per day. And they receive about, on average, 3,000 likes. But already, if you look at the likes, you start seeing a lot of heterogeneity, and you start seeing that attention is going to be very skewed. So we have 3,000 likes per day at the mean. This is about 31 at the median, and we have a very large standard deviation. About 9 to, let's say, 10% of all members of Congress go viral on a given day. On a given day. Now, it's always helpful, I think, to set ideas to compare kind of this very skewed attention distribution with what happens on traditional media. And so what we report here is information on mentions of members of Congress on cable news. And as you can start seeing, kind of cable news are somewhat equal, are very similarly concentrated, or are also very skewed, very concentrated. On average, we have about 1.5 mentions of members of Congress in a day. This is about 0 for the median. About 10%, a little more than 10%, so 11% of members of Congress get mentioned by cable news in any given day. And what is interesting is that of these 11%, 37% of them also go viral on Twitter. And so we start seeing this pattern that is going to be confirmed by a lot of the things that we do, that there is, of course, some correlation between attention on social media and attention on traditional media, and like also the people who are being talked about in the two. But you can generally think of this overlap of being about 50%, and there's also a lot of people that receive attention in one, but not the other. Also looking at donations, we see that donations are also fairly skewed. On average, the amount of small donation received is about $1,200, $3,000 if you condition on receiving at least a donation, but the median is much lower. And you're going to be receiving these donations from about 15 different individuals. Okay. So before I tell you a little bit more about what we do in our first empirical design, let me just spend 1 minute to discuss why Twitter. And in a way, kind of Valeria's question already pointed to the direction of why we think Twitter is interesting to look at. So Twitter is a significant media channel, especially for political communication. And what is especially interesting for us is that Twitter users are really more likely to be politically active relative to the general population. What we are showing here are data. So this is from the American National Elections Survey. And we are showing different characteristics and different political activities separately for different levels of Twitter usage. And as you can see, particularly from the first line, is that Twitter users are much more likely to donate to a candidate. They are also different, so unsurprisingly, they have a higher income, they are more educated, they tend to be more urban and more democratic. But what is interesting is that the difference in donations is not driven by these other demographics, by these other characteristics. If you run a simple regression in which you control for everything else, we still see that being a Twitter user predicts donations in a very correlational sense. And so perhaps if we're interested in studying donations, this is a population that we might be specifically interested in. Okay, so remember our objective is to estimate the relationship between attention on social media and campaign donations. And we use a member of Congress by date panel to do so. This is the specification that we estimate. Our outcome is the log+1 of the aggregate small campaign contributions that MOCI receives on day T. We regress it on the log+1 average likes per tweet of MOCI on day T. And then we include two sets of fixed effects. First, we have member of Congress by month fixed effects. And these are very important for us because they ensure that not only we exploit within MOC donations, so only within MOC variation, but we are also, but by interacting also with month, we are really only exploiting variation in periods where the level of donations is comparable. Because unsurprisingly, as you can expect, closer to election date, you have a lot more donations. In addition to this, we also have party-by-day fixed effects that are going to allow parties to be exposed to different shocks at the daily level. And we're going to be clustering standard errors at the member of Congress level throughout. So this is what we find. First, we find in general that there is a positive and statistically significant correlation between likes on Twitter and small donations. Our column 1 is kind of just the pure correlation. It only has a day fixed effect, but doesn't even have a member of Congress fixed effect, and we see a very large coefficient there. Now, unsurprisingly, a lot of this is driven by variation across members of Congress. So once we introduce our members of Congress fixed effect, which I guess any reasonable specification would have, the coefficient is cut by a factor of 10, but it's still statistically significant. Introducing kind of this flexibility on the party side by using the date by party fixed effects doesn't really change the coefficient. However, when we do restrict our identifying variation to be only within member of Congress and month, we do see a smaller coefficient that again is statistically significant. Now, in general, in this paper, we use kind of this log+1 transformation as kind of because we think it's kind of convenient, a convenient sort of transformation. But of course, we are very aware that to really interpret the magnitudes, that might not be ideal. And so the first thing that we do to understand magnitudes a little bit more is that we discretize. We discretize both we discretize the attention on Twitter variable, and then we estimate separately the intensive and the intensive margin for the donations. And so the way in which we do it is that we define an indicator variable equal to 1 if we are in the top 10% of the Twitter likes distribution. And already there we see that being in the top 10% on the Twitter likes distribution, which we generally define as going viral, increasing log+1 donation by 8.7 points. Now, what does it actually mean?
Sorry. Going viral here is defined in absolute terms, but if I am a congressman that always get only 100 likes, then for me getting 1,000 likes, I'm going viral, and that may have an effect on my supporters. So have you considered a member of Congress specific measure of how viral is viral? Thank you.
That's an excellent point. So I have to say we haven't done that. In general, yes, this is like across the entire distribution. We think that in a way, the way we're thinking about it is that there's something about being seen by lots of people. So even if you get seen by a lot more of even if you receive much more attention than you generally do, if it's not actually a lot of attention, that this might not be an effect. But I totally agree, this is something we can and should look at separately to at least know, are the effects different, or how do things look like if we do that, which we haven't done, but it's a good point to understand a little bit better what is going on here.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Great. So we also estimate separately the extensive and intensive margin, and what we see is that going viral on Twitter increases the probability that you receive at least a donation by 0.6 percentage point. This is about 1% of the baseline mean, but conditional on receiving at least a donation, it increases the amount received by about 5%. And this is going to be the number that we are going to use for a lot of our back of the envelope calculation to think about the magnitudes overall. Okay, as I said, here we already start seeing some evidence of a concentrated effect, but we also kind of go ahead and estimate this directly. And the way in which we do it is that we estimate kind of a step function. We do this as using a step function approach. And what you can see is that kind of returns are highly skewed. There's basically not a lot of action below the 80th percentile of the likes distribution, but in the top 20%, we find effects that are positive, and larger and larger the closer to the top you get. And in general, we kind of focus on this top 10%. Now, what is also interesting is that you might think that this is a somewhat mechanical effect. Each like has a marginal effect, and so you receive more like, you get more donations. But this is not exactly what we find, because if we estimate the elasticity of likes, of donation to likes, we're going to see that this is actually higher for viral tweets, showing that there is something specific about being seen by a lot of people, that each marginal like is still going to be more important or give higher returns that at lower level of the attention distribution. Now, something that I haven't spent a lot of time talking about yet is that, of course, we really like these estimates, but you know, you might have very real and very valid concerns about whether they are causal or not. And so we do a couple of things at this point to at least try and exclude some of the most obvious endogeneity concerns. So one of the things that you might be worried about is reverse causality. Maybe you get a donation, you're able to buy some ads to promote your tweets, and you're getting more attention on Twitter as a result. And so to speak to that and also understand more broadly the time pattern of our effect, we also estimate a specification with 10 leads and 10 lags. And what we find is that there is not a lot of anticipation going on. Things appear to be pretty flat. We have a contemporaneous effect that is large. The day in which you go viral, you also receive the donation. We have an effect kind of a similar magnitude the day after, and this effect goes away after about 2 or 3 days. So the fact that we have both contemporaneous and day after effect is not that surprising, because there's going to be perhaps potentially a mismatch in how we define a, you know, when you get attention on Twitter, we are using calendar days, but if you post at 11 p.m., maybe it's also relevant for the day after. So that's not surprising. It is interesting that after a while the effect goes away. If we extend it further, we also learn that we are not just picking up harvesting. What we mean by that is that kind of going viral on Twitter is not just inducing people that are going to donate for you anyways in 2 weeks. You're not inducing these people to donate to you now and then they reduce their donations down the line. It seems that you're really bringing in more donations you wouldn't have received otherwise. Now, the other big elephant in the room is that maybe it's not, you know, any sort of weird reverse causality. It's pure, simple, omitted variable bias. And the main thing that one could worry about is that there's something about the news cycle. You receive attention for whatever reason, you know, maybe there's a scandal, maybe something else is happening and you talk about it, you get attention on social media, and they also talk about you in traditional media. And so in order to speak to that, we estimate different specifications in which we add some of these additional controls. What this figure is showing is the coefficient of going viral on Twitter. On the left, we have specification in which we include our effect of going viral and the effect of each of these other controls separately. And then we have a regression in which we put everything together. And let's focus on the first 4 coefficients first, which are kind of our proxies for news cycle, which are what we find perhaps more relevant, more interesting here. What is very interesting in this finding is that we find that the effect of going viral on Twitter, so the effect of going viral on Twitter is very robust and really survives kind of being talked about in other types of media. What is also interesting is that being talked about on TV, so having at least one mention on cable news or being mentioned in a New York Times, not only don't do much for our coefficient, but also have a very similar effect themselves. Being talked about in local newspaper has about 50% of the effect. Now, we also consider other potential explanations of things that could be going on. Giving a speech in Congress does not have an effect. Being in a visit to the home district does not have an effect. And kind of a proxy for for rallies. So receiving a visit by the president or the vice president does not have an effect either. And so the way in which we're thinking about this result is that they're pointing towards some sort of segmentation on the news market. The returns are comparable, but because they survive kind of controlling everything together, it seems that they might accrue to different people. And so perhaps some people are going to be very good at kind of building their audience on Twitter. They receive attention on Twitter. They're able to bring home returns from that point of view. Some people are going to be specializing on communications on TV, and this is what is going to be working for them. But definitely, we're not seeing any evidence that all we're finding in terms of attention on Twitter is just something that has to do with being talked about more broadly. Now, something else that we are very
Arianna,
interested.
can I ask something here that I think is partially relevant to this, or maybe the previous point? Have you tried to sort of recover or record a sequence of events when a news is breaks out? So very often I notice local news or newspapers quote tweets as evidence that something is going on. So something breaks out on Twitter, and obviously it goes the other way around. Sometimes the tweets quote newspapers, and then a story develops on Twitter just for people to discuss. So I'm coming back to kind of the not the likes themselves, but retweets and those conversations that are at the bottom. Now I don't know how would that work, but there is this, because there is a sequence of things, then that could speak to causality.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. We haven't really done that. What I can tell you is that if we exclude, and we have mainly worked on this on the cable news, because for that it's very easy to get the full transcript. So, and there's also, in a way, like a lot more space because there are 24 hours news channels. So there's more interesting things to be done there. So what we have done so far is if we drop all days in which are mentioned on cable news, we still find the same effect for Twitter. And something that I'm working on, and I should be working on right now, is also we are trying to look directly at when you're mentioned on cable news, are they also mentioning your tweet somewhere kind of in the vicinity? And I am halfway through writing the code for that. I just need to implement it. But indeed, that's something that we are thinking about. We are also very aware that we really like these results, but also we know that we're still not, basically with this approach, we're still not going to be able to fully get at causality, which is why we also have the geography design, because you could think of, there are a lot of kind of news subtle, a little bit more subtle ways of thinking about the news cycle that this doesn't pick up. So for example, suppose an issue is very important for the politician, and the issue becomes very relevant for some external event. Maybe the politician talks about it on Twitter and they receive a lot of attention because they are the go-to person for that issue, but also they get mentioned on TV because they are the go-to person for that. And those are things that are very difficult to measure. We could play around with it, but in the end, we think that no matter how many controls we add, it's not going to be the full story. And so we also have this geography design to say, but actually is what we are finding causal, and we're going to find kind of results that go in the same direction that we find reassuring. Okay.
I've got a related question. So I understand the purpose of the exercise for the econometrics, but in terms of story, I'm a bit puzzled. So here, from what you're showing us, I can see that the coefficients are of similar magnitude, so the returns of these things are similar. But is also your purpose to shut them down as mechanisms? Because if that's the case, then I end up being super puzzled. Like the population on Twitter is weird, and so are we just talking about the returns of being viral on donations among the population that's only on Twitter, or
there could be part of that? Maybe where kind of what we're picking up with Twitter is like returns from attention from kind of the very politically engaged, and maybe, I mean, I guess the New York Times reader are somewhat similar. Maybe the local newspapers are a little bit different. But effectively, here, what we're interested in is not so much thinking precisely about where they're coming from, but exactly showing how kind of we're thinking more about the returns in terms of characterizing this market for attention and thinking about how they're distributed, who they accrue to, like on the politician side, rather than who exactly they're bringing it in. There's more that we can do. We have some information about the donors that we could potentially use for that, but we haven't done that yet.
I think what I have in mind is a mechanism, and I think also with Max, that's similar to this recent paper, Sofia and Katya Zarevskaya, where the attention you compete for on Twitter is not really the attention of the politically engaged user, but the attention of newsmakers who then
I mean, that's potentially, that could be going on, but like these robustness exercises are telling us that that's not the case. There is something for these campaign donations that is really coming from kind of getting a lot of eyeballs on your tweets that goes beyond just your tweet being picked up by the news cycle. And indeed, I mean, there is a little bit of talking about the tweets for these politicians, but it's definitely not going to, so we have to do a little bit more work at exactly estimating that. But it's definitely not the case that all of these tweets get talked about on TV. In this case, it's still like kind of a minority. I think we have to do better numbers. We have to put better numbers on that. But even if you look at Trump, there's of course like a lot of his tweets do get picked up. A lot of what he does online does get picked up, but it's not 100% of them. And for these politicians, it's going to be even more because there's less attention. But we're working on kind of making the argument a little bit more robust with actual better measurement.
Just to drill one more thing here. So interesting you mentioned the donation. So because the alternative to Valeria's story is that this is addressed to newsmakers. It could be engaged to really keep people behind the scenes, the gray lords that oversee everything and make those donations. But so you mentioned there is some data on who makes those donations, and you are focusing on small donations, which suggests just regular Joes.
Exactly. So here we're really focusing on donations in value of less than $1,000, but the median donation amount is even smaller. Actually, if we go smaller, we still find the effect. So we're really not thinking about exactly convincing. So that's why we're not thinking about this as, oh, you're having a persuasive effect or on somebody in their decision to donate or whatnot. It's more like, it's kind of an expressive motive for donation, which is again like kind of similar to what the Bhutan paper finds. The idea is that a lot of these small campaign donations are a way of expressing support, kind of in a fast reaction. And so in a way, I think if we were to find a lot of movement from kind of the big donors or donations from kind of larger amount, this would be maybe not as plausible, but the idea is really that you kind of go in front of somebody's eyeballs and kind of they're reminded of you, maybe there's some salience effect, they donate. We're going to see that you're bringing these donations, you're not moving across time your supporters, you're not doing a lot of harvesting, is really some sort of kind of, I'm thinking about it as a salience effect of, and then you express support for that person because you were reminded of them because they went viral on Twitter.
And donations are not manipulable by, there is not like.
In terms of reporting, no. Okay. As far as we can, we can tell. But they're kind of very strictly regulated. And so, potentially, I think what we might be worried about, it's not this like $20, $50, $100 donation. Maybe there are something that goes on with like larger amounts, but they tend to go through different channels. Here we're looking at individual donations that I think are capped at $5,000 throughout the election cycle. So it's kind of a different type of world.
Sorry, I'm gonna bother you again. There's a question in the chat. So can you differentiate between tweets that explicitly ask for donations and not?
Great. Yes, just wait a couple of slides and I'll show you the results for that. Okay. Perfect. So another thing that we're very interested in is understanding whether there are spillovers in attention or donation across different members of Congress. And so we look at spillovers along 3 different lines. We look at spillovers from along a geography line, so people who come from the same state, who represent the same state. We look at an ideology, kind of an ideological spillover. So we look at people who are close in ideology. And then we look at people that are close to you on the Twitter network. And there, kind of in general, we are just kind of counting the number of viral tweets for people that fall under this description. In the first one, which is the Twitter network version, what we are doing is that we are looking at, so we are counting the numbers of other members of Congress on a day that you go viral, we count the number of other tweets that go viral, and we weight by the overlap in followers across the different members of Congress. And so what we find is that there seems to be some competition on attention, some negative spillovers. They're kind of all there, but it seems to be that particularly the spillover on the Twitter network is doing a lot of the work. And so kind of the way to interpret this coefficient is that if another member of Congress that has a 100% overlap with your followers goes viral, you're 5.1 percentage point less likely to go viral yourself. Now, what is interesting, though, is that conditional on still going viral, we are not really seeing spillover on the donation side, which again is kind of, I think for us is this idea that is really getting kind of, there are some interesting dynamics in terms of attention, but as long as you go viral, as long as you get the attention, then your returns are kind of stable. Okay, so.
But sorry. In a way, one way to think about donations and why you don't pick up, I'm not surprised that you don't pick up the effect, because if I'm donating to my congressman, it doesn't matter what the other congressman may do, because I care whether or not what my does. It's not that you're not looking at a campaign stage where I can choose in the primary, or I mean, undecided between a Democrat or a Republican candidate. So in a way, that's the way I would have thought that donations you don't pick up any effect on the donation side, right?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to exactly think about it. I think, there's a different view in which you have a certain budget. You say, oh, this donation, which would explain the spillovers on donation, which is like, oh, I've decided I'm going to give out $500 this electoral cycle. So if somebody goes viral, I donate to them, and then I'm not going to donate to somebody else, which doesn't seem to be what is going on here.
Exactly, because otherwise I will have to say, well, I really care that candidates from certain parties are elected. I don't care if they are my representative or someone else, but that really requires quite a bit of stretch to believe that voters are so strategic.
Yeah, exactly. So here we're really thinking about this expressive motive for donation. I think a lot of what we are seeing is really pointing in this direction. It's really kind of expressing support, and you make a $20 donation, which with the very small donation seems to be somewhat in line with what we're finding. Great. So just very briefly, how are we thinking about the magnitudes? Well, viral day increases donation by 5%. This is about $128 at the mean. Could be a lower bound. I think it's a lower bound. In general, what we then see is that if we just project it based on the number of days in which people go viral, we see that the top 5 members of Congress in terms of Twitter attention are going to earn about $75,000 more just from going viral on Twitter. The persuasion rate is like around the 2.5%. And so in general, the way we're thinking about this is that, I mean, unsurprisingly, because of what I've shown you so far, those returns tend to be fairly concentrated. So we're going to have some winners, but it's not the case that everyone who's on Twitter is really able to kind of get a lot more donations just from building attention on Twitter, because attention is pretty hard to get. Okay, so some things very briefly. You may think that maybe there's a lot of interesting heterogeneity, and indeed on the attention side, we do recover the standard heterogeneity that has been shown in the literature. Younger members of Congress are more likely to go viral. Candidates with more extreme ideology are also more likely to go viral. There's a little bit of an effect for Democrats. But what is interesting is that if we look at the heterogeneity of the effect of going viral on donations, we are really not seeing a lot of heterogeneity there. So it seems that, again, we have kind of some movement in terms of that on the attention side, but not a lot of movement in terms of the returns. What if we look at tweet content? Well, there's a lot of interesting things we can do here. First of all, we kind of replicate the standard finding that tweets with a negative sentiment and tweets with high toxicity are more likely to go viral. However, conditional on going viral, the returns for kind of different content are very similar. So it's really this idea of attention, of going viral, that is going to matter. Now, the question in the chat was asking about tweets that directly solicit donations. And what we find is that in general, those are very rare. So it's not very common that kind of asking directly for donations or even posting kind of the link at which people donate is something that doesn't happen all that much. Now, because they're so rare, the heterogeneity is not that meaningful. But if we want to take the point estimate at face value, I mean, and you can see from the confidence intervals that perhaps we shouldn't do that. But it does seem to suggest that if you go viral on a day and you're also smart and you put your donation link, maybe that is a good strategy. But the main takeaway is that we don't think that what is going on is this direct soliciting of donations, because it's quantitatively not that relevant. It's very, very rare. You might also think that there's something going on in terms of really reaching to your audience, but again, we don't see a lot of heterogeneity in whether you mention one of the places of your congressional district in your tweet. Okay, so I'm gonna skip this in the interest of time, and we do a lot of robustness, and things look fairly robust. Okay, with the last few minutes I have left, I want to just tell you briefly about this geography-based design that is trying to move us closer to causality. And the motivation for doing this, as I've already mentioned, is that yes, our specification is quite restrictive. We put in a bunch of controls, we do a lot of fixed effects, but effectively it's very hard to make a full causal statement because the donation-likes relationship might still be driven by some other activities beyond Twitter. So there could be attention shocks not proxied by cable news or the other news controls that we have, or there could be kind of in real life activities such as rallies that might also play a role. And so we do two things here. The first thing that we do is that we test whether the increase in donation is really coming from those areas, those states in which Twitter is more prominent. That is, states that have a higher number of Twitter users. And this has the additional advantage, just as a start, that it allows us to estimate even more restrictive specifications. And so, for example, we have specifications that include member of Congress by day fixed effect that take care of a lot of concerns. So this is the specification that we estimate. Is same as before. We have this interaction between likes and users. And then we have, in this case, member of Congress by day fixed effect, state by day fixed effect, and member of Congress by state by month fixed effect. And we cluster standard errors at the MOC and at the state level. And what we find is that, consistent with this idea that we are picking up something that has to do with Twitter, if kind of the increase in donations that a member of Congress gets on a day in which they receive attention on Twitter is larger in states that have higher Twitter usage. Now, you may think Twitter usage is correlated with a lot of additional things like education or whatnot, basically the things I showed you at the very beginning. If we include controls for that, we find a very similar effect. And what is also interesting is that for the average number of users, the marginal effect of an additional like is very similar to what we estimated before. Now, this is reassuring, but we still might be worried that we are picking up something else, like differences across states, or maybe something that has to do with other social networks. And so, following Muller and Schwartz, we also implement an AV design that uses a shock to early Twitter adoption, that uses the attendance to the South by Southwest Festival in 2009 as an instrument for current Twitter usage. And the idea behind this instrument is that South by Southwest in 2007 was really a tipping point for Twitter's popularity. They had this big advertising campaign, and this resulted in a large increase in users. So if we think with how a lot of these instruments kind of hypothesize that early adoption is persistent, then perhaps we can use the location of the Twitter's early adopters South by Southwest as an instrument for Twitter usage today. And kind of we're using the same data that they kindly share with us to implement this design. And identification is going to require that the intensity of early Twitter adoption is not related to an observed state characteristics that might affect how attention impacts donations. This is what we find. We find a strong first stage that you can see in column 7 to 9. There is a positive and statistically significant relationship between our instrument and our endogenous variable that we're instrumenting, that we're using the instrument to instrument. Once we estimate our two-stage least square, which are columns 4 to 6, we do find, again, point estimates that have a very similar magnitude, which we find very reassuring, and we think it's really pointing towards the fact that we're not just picking up, kind of our first part of the paper is not just picking up a correlation. Maybe there's some causality that's behind the relationship that we find. Okay, so to conclude, in this paper, we find that attention on Twitter increases the contribution for small donors, which shows that Twitter can be an effective technology to raise donations. However, because returns are highly concentrated, this is not something that just happens for everyone. And indeed, only a few members of Congress are able to harness attention. So it seems that different members of Congress might have different communication niche that they might be successful at in terms of raising donation more generally. What is also reassuring is that we don't find that these campaign returns are likely to create perverse incentives on messaging, which is something that we could potentially worry about. Okay, so this is it for my presentation. Thank you so much for all the comments. And if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. But thank you so much for all the comments and questions already.
Good. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Arianna for the presentation. I don't know if there are questions now. Perhaps we can stop the recording. And if people have extra questions, they can ask them now as well.
If I can, sorry. In a way, I was surprised by the result on the states, because going back to what I was saying before, if the idea is really that I donate because my politician has gone viral, then should be that most of the donation comes from my own state. So which kind of variations are you picking up across states? Or otherwise saying, wouldn't it be interesting doing the same analysis by looking at the variation across counties within the states or within the district that elects a senator or member of Congress? There, I would buy much more the story. But then now that you showed us the result with the states, I'm not sure what to make of those results with the states.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And indeed, we are working on redoing the same thing using county level data, which we have is just like we run into a couple of technical issues implementing it, but we are doing it. I think we're going to have the results very soon, fingers crossed. And indeed, that's kind of the direction where we're going. In general, here, the point that we want to make is more about kind of where Twitter is a relevant communication, communication technology. So if there's not a lot of people on Twitter, then it doesn't matter as much. But I don't know, I think we could do more to look exactly at kind of within district and outside district, kind of where the donations are coming from, which we started doing, but we haven't fully done now that everything is coming together. So we probably should go back and have a look, because that would be just an interesting piece of evidence, both to understand the mechanism, but also more generally, there's some concern that maybe like this Twitter activity is driving perhaps this nationalization of elections generally, and being able to say something about it in terms of returns to attention, I think would be interesting. In addition to, of course, understanding a little bit better the mechanisms and what is going on. Thanks.
Francesco, you have a question?
Well, it's more of a half serious comment. There is a debate now in the United States as to whether what Elon Musk has done to Twitter amounts to violation of campaign laws. And actually, well, this is evidence that what happens on Twitter is related to campaign donations and so on. So maybe this was already obvious to people, but this is evidence that there is a relationship between. So if you change the algorithm to push particular sides, you are essentially favoring those sides in terms of donations. And that pretty much, I think, would indicate a violation of campaign. Now, of course, the same guys have won the election, so they're not going to prosecute this. Basically, the guy who did this is going to be in charge. So, you know, maybe not. But perhaps in the future, is something that people would need to keep in mind. We now have ways of, to some extent, at least showing that there is a temporal relationship. You put a tweet, and a few days later, if it goes viral, you get more money. And if somebody modifies the algorithm to make it go viral, then you get more money. I mean, it probably isn't a surprise to anybody, but there's evidence.
No, and it's interesting because, I mean, in general, of course, it's a little bit hard to like extrapolate exactly from our precise finding, which are like very specific, very short term. But I think in general, this idea that independently of what we think the objective for being on Twitter is, kind of returns to like receiving a lot of attention might play an important role, even if maybe your objective is building a brand of Twitter or like reaching out to specific subparts of the population. Like it does matter, and just kind of I think in general there is some evidence that what happens on the back end is very important. I mean, on a side note, for example, if you look at Blue Sky, there's a lot of media organizations that are now saying that, well, yeah, they're getting a lot more returns from attention on Blue Sky in terms of clicks than they were receiving on Twitter, consistent with this idea of like shadow downgrading of the posts that they were posting on different platforms. And so I think this is a super interesting area that maybe we don't have a lot to think about in this paper, but in general, kind of what happens on the back end is definitely super important if we think of this attention market angle, for sure.